to Property Summits, the show to tune into to find out all about the latest developments in the property world. I'm Emma Birchley, and joining me today are 6 of the most experienced people in the business. Now, first off, we have Ranjan Bhattacharya, a man who's been developing and investing in property for 30 years. We also have Tony Gimple, the one in the know when it comes to tax, accountancy or succession planning. Also joining me is Nicholas Wallwork, an investor, developer and author who's also the owner of the world's largest property forum. We also have Richard Bush, founder of the crowdfunding platform Crowdlords, which provides more people with the chance to invest in property. Here too is best-selling author and serial entrepreneur Paul Mahoney, a real expert in the world of buy-to-let. And finally today, we have John Howard, a man who knows a thing or two about property, having bought and sold a staggering 4,000 houses, apartments and developments over more than 4 decades in the industry. Welcome to you all. So today, it's rent caps. This is your topic, John.
Is it?
Yeah, what is a rent cap?
Okay, well, a rent cap is what's put on by a government to control the rents, and they will limit the increase in rents that are allowed. And interestingly, and a lot of people probably wouldn't appreciate it, but rent caps came into the UK government in 1915, on the 23rd, I think it was, of December, and it was done because of the war at the time. And rent caps didn't come off until 1988. They were only meant to be on a temporary basis, but they stayed on all that time. They changed over the years with the Rent Acts, but basically, in the old days, I say the old days because I used to buy a lot of, they were called regulated tenants, and Ranjan probably did as well. Tony knows all about these, and Richard, the younger members probably here of the team don't. And what happened was that you would buy investment properties at 50% of vacant possession value because you couldn't get the tenants out. They were there for life. And under Labour, there was 3 successions. So not only were the people allowed to stay, but so were their children and their children's children. Under the Tory government, they cut it down to 2 successions. And then in 1988, Margaret Thatcher got rid of it and created short-hold tenancies, which meant you could get tenants out. And of course, now they're talking about going back, allowing tenants to stay as long as they want, and landlords not being allowed to get people out of their accommodation.
So that's something we see quite a lot in France and places like that, don't we? With the
yes, you do. 33 European countries have some sort of rent cap or not. Ireland is a really good example where it's all gone wrong. So in Ireland in 2016, they brought in rent caps. And the increase was allowed, the maximum increase was 4% a year. That was reduced last year to 2% a year, or CPI, the link to the index.
Consumer Prices Index.
Consumer Price Index. And if I said to you that 2 months ago, only 700 rental properties were available in the whole of Southern Ireland of a population of 5 million, you can see how the rent caps are a disaster.
So rent caps are good news for people in those properties, but not if you're trying to get one, and not for the people who own them? Or
no,
what?
it just doesn't, it basically doesn't work. What they're talking about in Ireland now is reducing the tax on landlords to encourage landlords to still do buy-to-lets, because what's happened is all the private landlords, and they're so important, private landlords in the UK, and Ireland obviously, that what's happened is they've sold their properties because they don't want to be part of all this, and it's caused massive problems in the UK. Scotland has rental zones which local authority can apply to have put in, so perhaps parts of Edinburgh, very expensive areas might have that. Interestingly, Wales, who are pretty left-wing Wales, they had a vote and voted against rent caps recently. And in England, the new laws coming out shortly on social housing, they're going to put a rent cap on social housing. It will be 3 or 5%.
And will that just be for England?
Or will it? That will probably be just for England, yes.
Right, okay. So has anyone else noticed the impact of rent caps?
I think rent caps are a disaster for tenants.
Oh, really?
Absolutely. It's an absolute disaster for tenants, and there's several reasons for that. Let's say there's a rent cap that says, I can't rent a room or a property of this type for more than £500. What that will mean is it will diminish choice. Let's take training shoes, for example. You can buy a Nike training shoe for hundreds of pounds. You can buy something from Primark for £10. If you had a price cap on training shoes at £15, then everyone will produce cheap training shoes. So there's no incentive to produce a better product. What there is an incentive to price everything up to the maximum rent cap and deliver the quality that's appropriate. So it diminishes choice. And it also doesn't mean that the right people get those properties. I mean, I go back to Friends, the sitcom, and in the final episode, they revealed how Monica got that flat. And it was given to her grandmother on rent control, and it was passed down illegally to them to live in. And although that is a sitcom and fictional, that is actually what happens. Wherever you introduce rent caps, the wrong people end up with the flats. So it's bad news for the people that want the property, it's bad news for choice as well.
But if you're already in a property and you know that next year your rent can't go up more than 2% if you're in Ireland, surely you're kind of going woohoo.
The other thing is, a lot of landlords that I speak to have not increased their rents since before COVID, because of the times and all of that. The talk of the advent of a possible cap in the annual price rise means that everyone is jacking up their rents to market levels now.
What worries me is the attitude of tenants through COVID. They've been so protected by the government from eviction rules, and that's now starting to filter into, well, do we actually want to keep this?
But that's going to continue under the rules that I think the government are thinking
Getting rid
of
of Section 21, aren't they?
Section 21, Section 24 and so on. I think they are seriously talking about rent caps. Seriously talking
the first time in my
Yeah.
history.
The government has a strong track record of intervening and failing. Generally, whenever the government intervenes in our society, they don't do it very well.
Agreed.
You know, the market should be determined by the market. And when they try to manipulate that, you have what happens in Ireland. You know, 10 years down the track, they realise, oh God, we made a big mistake. And they have to go back and then incentivise people to do exactly what they were trying to disincentivise.
Exactly. I think it works, obviously it works in the short term for the tenants. It's great news for the tenants in the short term. In the long run, it sort of works for landlords as well, because if you can't get tenants out of a property, as in the old days, the price of that property goes down by half. So people like us and other investors end up buying these properties with tenants in. In time, the tenants leave and you double your money. That's how I started in the property industry. And I've still got one or two regulated tenants left, not many now.
And with the rent caps, is that now, at the same time, we're going to get greater controls on being able to not evict people?
Absolutely. The eviction situation is going to change. I think they're going to not allow any of us to evict any tenant that's done nothing wrong. I believe they're going to bring that in.
Isn't that a good thing for the tenant?
Well, again, it's a good thing for the tenant, I suppose. The idea, the whole point is, if you've got a family and they've moved into a school and you want them out within 12 months, that family and the children have probably got to move to a different area, a different school and so on. That's the thinking behind it, I think. But of course, all the time, you're knocking the landlord, and private landlords in the UK are so important to the property market. They are vitally important.
The issue's the bad tenants, not the good ones, right? So you get 1 in 100 tenants is a professional bad tenant, I call them, and they know all the rules and they string it out. And you've got to then prove they've done something wrong to get them out, which is getting harder and harder.
By the way, it's not just the property market. One of the reasons Margaret Thatcher got rid of all of this, and she did the right thing to do, it's about labour market mobility, and particularly labour market mobility in professional middle-class jobs, because there's got to be a working rental market for there to be a flexible labour market.
Yes. No, I see that, and I think you make a very good point there that people need that flexibility. And as a landlord, why should someone tell me that I can't get my house back? Now they'll make exceptions. So, for instance, if it's your own, if you can prove you're going to move in it to yourself, then obviously they probably will allow you to get possession. But otherwise, you can't get possession of your own properties. It's madness.
John, is that only during the tenancy? At the end of the tenancy period, you can...
No. If they want to continue, they can continue living there as long as they want. That's what
at the same rental?
At the same, well, unless it's capped, of course.
Right.
You know, you can negotiate.
Keeping in mind that the cap doesn't mean you can't increase the rent. It will be at a certain, probably with inflation.
2%.
Likely with inflation.
2%, I should think maximum.
But with Ireland, it's either inflation or 2%, whichever's lower.
Exactly.
I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But it's important to keep in mind as well that if these changes do come into place, landlords are going to have to be a lot more selective. So you might think this is a good thing for tenants, especially tenants at the bottom end of the rung. Yeah. Actually, it's really bad for them because they're going to find it even more difficult to find rentals because a landlord such as myself, I'm not going to take a risk on someone that can't afford the rent. I'm going to get the best possible tenant into my property because if I can't evict that person, have to have them for a number of years, I want them to not cause me any headaches.
There's an even, sorry, John, if I may, there's an even bigger knock-on effect, and that is the supply and demand imbalance we have already in the housing stock. If landlords are being put off coming into being landlords, that private rental sector is going to diminish. Absolutely. And there'll be even less housing for everyone to live in. It's going to cause a massive shitstorm.
Absolutely. And what's happened in Ireland, of course, because of COVID, they locked everything down. Unlike this government here, which did a pretty good job, in Ireland they locked down all the building industry. So that has caused even more problems. There was an article the other day, 550 people going for one property in Ireland. 550 people going for one property.
So for people like you who are looking at places to maybe buy property, rent it out, would you be really put off picking somewhere where there were rent caps?
Well, what I would say, Emma, and it'd be interesting to see what Richard and Tony have got to say, because actually, what about the funding of these things? Because if you can't get the tenant out, what lending institution are going to lend you 75% of vacant possession value? They're not. They're going to lend you 75% of tenanted value, which will be probably 30% less than vacant possession, I would say. And in some cases, down to 50%.
So it hits the values again.
It's bound to have a knock-on effect on values, isn't it? It's bound to. But to take Nick's point about there being bad tenants, there are bad landlords. And I guess, yes, John, there are. And so I guess the whole point is to protect people against bad landlords, not against good landlords. We've never had an issue getting tenants out of our properties.
Well, no, you won't do, because by law, you can do so. But if there's a rent cap, and if there's a rent cap, and you're told that evictions cannot take place unless the tenant's done something wrong, you could have tenants for 30, 40 years.
Yeah, but if the tenant's done nothing wrong and they're paying the rent according to the agreement that we have, then I don't think I necessarily should have the right.
Why shouldn't you be able to get why shouldn't you be able to get a property that you own vacant if you want it?
The other thing is you're not taking into account problems which will materialise, which don't materialise here yet because we haven't got that system, and that will be people taking advantage of the fact that they got possession of a property cheap. So they'll be Airbnb-ing it, which happens a lot with social housing, particularly in London. Councils have fraud teams looking for people doing this, and also passing it on to their kids. It's not their property to do that, it's a rental property. So when people have an asset that they can control and it's cheap, it's under market value, you will get people changing their behaviour to take advantage of that.
It is doing
that
something wrong
everywhere.
Though, in fairness, right?
Yes,
that is
theft.
a reason to get rid of them.
Precisely.
Yeah.
In the old days, there used to be there used to be what's called key money. Yes. Do you remember those days, Tony? Where someone had a regulated property, so you couldn't get the tenant out, and what they would do is sell the key, if you like, to that property for 10, 15, 20,000 to someone else to go in. All that sort of thing used to happen, and of course that is illegal.
What would they do when they went in?
They'd give the person who's leaving key money, 10, 20,000 pounds.
Right,
because if it was a regulated tenancy, there's nothing the landlord could do. But that actually is against the law to give key money.
Thank goodness it's not 100 years ago. And this has all been a bit doom and gloom. And I'm just going to try to brighten this up a little bit. My strategy for investing in property is very much attractive properties, central locations, an abundance of reasons for people to want and need to live there. So there's already significant demand for those types of properties. You've
huge
already
demand.
got a lot of choice. Yeah. We target people like doctors, professionals working in the city, professionals working at universities, those types of things. They're the tenants you very, very rarely have problems with. So regardless of all this doom and gloom, those types of properties still make sense.
And that's the market to focus on.
That's the market to focus on.
Everything else is.
But there's an awful lot of people in this country that need homes and need housing, and they're not doctors, they're not nurses, they're not, so...
Yeah, no,
So
I
are you
understand
saying
that.
that?
But unless we change our statuses to registered charities, it's going to be uneconomic to provide homes for that segment of the population. The government will have to step in. If we are business people, then we are going to provide homes where it makes economic sense to do so. That's just a simple
And if
fact.
it doesn't, we won't.
We
And
won't.
That's the sad
That's
thing.
it. We'll exit.
Tony, this government may not bring this in, but if Labour get in,
Yes.
they're going to bring it in. They're going to bring it in. They're definitely going to bring it in, aren't they?
The worst thing that could happen for the economy, for the private rented sector, for tenants, for developers, would be a left-wing government, by far. Because they'll play to the gallery, do what they have to do to get elected, and then you'll see a repeat of the classic cycle of nobody will build, nobody will buy, there'll be disincentives.
People like us to build,
Well, not just people like us, but the
develop.
aspiration will go out the window because you'll be back to the nanny state. But there's a balance between having a free market and having a free and fair market. Yes. And I suppose it comes down, and we'll cover the politics of it later, but it comes down, you have an obligation. If you're going to be a tenant, be a good tenant. If you're going to be a landlord, be a good landlord. If you're going to be a developer, be the best you possibly can. If you can build properties that people want to live in, either as social housing, as subsidised housing, or as high-end luxury, well, that's your choice as the developer and landlord.
Tony, I bet anyone here who wants to bet with me that in the Labour manifesto it will say we will bring in rent caps and we'll also bring in no eviction for tenants.
I don't think it will.
I think they will. How much would you like to?
I'm not a betting man, John.
I'm not either, but when there's a dead cert, I'm happy.
But I don't think it's a popular, as you make it sound, I don't think it's a popular sort of policy.
Well, if they learn from, if you learn from other countries, then certainly you learn from Southern Ireland, then you won't bring it in. But you can't guarantee that.
So Wales have made a choice, you said, to go against it. Did that, and that surprised you?
That did surprise me because I'm doing some deals in Wales at the moment, and the councils and the government, the Welsh Assembly, is very difficult to deal with, and left wing. And I was very surprised that they turned it down. They thought they weren't going to. They thought they were going to bring it in, and then they didn't. In Scotland, they've sort of brought it in certain areas, these zones, and maybe that's a compromise that it should come in places. I would like to see it personally where Ranjan's got most of his investment properties.
You're just a NIMBY.
Which is in London and so on. They all think they're so clever in London, don't they? And the rest of us don't have it, which would be great.
Did you know why they chose in Wales not to go ahead?
I think they looked at Ireland and thought, it's not quite such a good idea. They'll come up with some sort of, quango-y thing, I'm sure, instead. And maybe they'll pick zones like Scotland, although Scotland now, having tried it with zones, are now talking about going further. Whether they will or not, again, left-wing government. And
where are the zones usually in Scotland? Where are they usually set up? Are they in city centres to allow people to live there, or...?
Yes, so in Scotland, what you've got to appreciate, and some people do, some people don't, but Edinburgh is the second most expensive city in the UK. What is the third? I'll leave you to think about that. So what's happening is certain areas of the councils are putting just certain roads in these zones. They're not doing a blanket. They're doing certain zones, which is perhaps a compromise, because if young people can't live in a city where they've had a university and they've got a job, they've been to university, had a job, then there's a problem, because young people are what keeps these cities alive. It's not older people that move out and buy a big house. It's the young people who keep it vibrant. And if they can't afford to live there, that's a massive problem.
So there's
Sorry, Emma. Did you not think that at the moment there's a shortage of rental properties, and as it is, rents are going up because demand is greater than supply? So any government that brings in that type of policy is going to just make the problem worse. It is, you know, it's an
Well,
illogical...
you can say that, but 33 countries across Europe have some sort of rent cap.
But they're not necessarily in the same market situation that we're in, where there's a shortage of rental properties.
I think most of them are in a position where there is a shortage of rental properties. Okay, some Eastern Europe countries may not have, but certainly France, Germany, Spain don't have a rent cap, Portugal don't have a rent cap, but certainly France does, Germany does, Italy does, sort of. So, you know, a lot of these countries, I wouldn't say they're blanket caps, they are in certain areas, which probably is a compromise. Ranjan won't like that, of course.
It's a vicious spiral. You know, you put in a rent cap, it diminishes supply, and that just exasperates the problem. The solution is to make sure that people can bring on more supply. It's not the landlords or the property owners. Allow more build-to-rent schemes. You know, allow more specialist housing blocks dedicated for rental to be built. It's very, very hard to get those through the planning system in the areas where people want to rent.
Well, the one thing I will say is that this government have allowed councils to build properties, flats and houses, and that's the first time since 1988 when Margaret Thatcher stopped it when they came into power, and that's helped. I mean, I'm in the process of selling a number of a portfolio to a council because they're short of housing. So, you know, that's an interesting, and that will help the situation. And that's why they're going to put, the government are definitely going to put rent caps on social housing, I think, because there's people, I'm not looking at too many people here who have taken advantage of social housing, Nicholas, but, you know, there are people that have been taking advantage of investing in social housing, and of course, because of that, the rents have gone up, and the government have said, hang on a minute, enough is enough, we're going to put a cap on that. The cap will definitely come on social housing this year.
And going back to Scotland again, you were talking about Edinburgh, you were talking about someone who's been a student there, they then get a profession.
Yeah.
Those zones you talk about, are they for everybody, for the professional and also for the social housing, or can you get zones that are just for social housing, for example?
I think the thing about the zones is it can be quite flexible. So at the moment, the zones are for private landlords. And it may be that in 1915, for instance, if you were in London and you had a more expensive house that you were renting, it didn't come under the Property Act at all, the Rent Act. Whereas the lower type property, the cheaper type property did, to protect people's, so they could live there forever and not have an issue going forward. You know, we'll just have to see what happens, won't we? But it's quite concerning, I think, if you're a funder and a banker, because if you can't get possession, you know,
well, it's short-sighted, isn't it? The whole thing is short-sighted. It's short-term benefit for long-term pain.
Yeah.
I've got a theory on this. I think the private rented sector is very disorganised, and we don't have really a lobby group, a significant voice in government at all, but the banks do. And the buy-to-let mortgage product was only created because of the AST, the Assured Shareholder Tenancy, which Margaret Thatcher brought in. She brought it in 1986, 87. Buy-to-let mortgages came in early 1990s, simply because of the Section 21. And I think those guys are going to react very, very strongly because they've got a lot riding on this. They've got a lot of properties which are secured on buy-to-let assets, and they will be lobbying behind the scenes to make sure this doesn't happen.
Take an example. A property that is worth 200,000 vacant, okay? You can't get it vacant. You borrowed 150,000 on it, on 200, which wouldn't be unreasonable. What's it worth if you can't get the tenant out?
Not a lot.
Yeah.
And there's another thought I'd like to throw out there. Why is it that a buy-to-let landlord should have any less or more rights than a bank mortgage holder? You know, if Barclays has someone and they're not paying their mortgage, there's a repossession proceedings. Why should it be any better or worse for a landlord?
Well, the landlord will be able to get the tenant out if they're not paying the rent. But of course, what tenant isn't going to pay the rent if they've got security forevermore, for life, basically?
It's a good point you made there, Ranjan, with regards to the banks having more influence than landlords, in that buy-to-let is a massive part of their lending portfolio now. And actually, it's a much more profitable part of their portfolio than home loans.
Yes.
There's a much bigger margin.
Yeah.
You know, limited company buy-to-let mortgages are now at about 5%. You can still do a home loan at 3%.
Yep.
So that fact means that these things will be curbed a little bit. You know, we're talking a bit of doom and gloom here, but the banks will put their hand up and say, well, wait a second, this is going to affect our bottom line.
The Conservatives may not bring this in, but if you're Labour and you don't believe that anyone should own more than one house, which is what most Labour MPs believe.
You don't know that to be
That
true.
is what most Labour MPs believe. They believe in social housing. They believe, some of them believe you should you should be able to own your house. Starmer does because he lives in a nice.
They're not fools though, John. They know that the 2 million landlords out there contribute to the housing stock.
But they'll see it that they will still continue because they've got a long-term income, which is fine. And for many of us investing here, you know, I've got properties I've owned, you know, 30, 35 years. They're still let. It's not a problem to me, but it is a problem if you genuinely want to sell a property vacant and you can't get it vacant. That is a problem.
I think the key. I think, if I may, just quickly, we've glossed over this point, but I think the key really, if there is going to be rent caps, is what are the rules for getting people out? Because surely, if they are acting illegally, you can evidence that, you should be able to get them out. So surely the key is in what constitutes a breach of those rules.
That's not the issue. My issue is if I own a property and I want it vacant, why the hell shouldn't I be able to get it vacant?
No, I completely agree. I'm not disagreeing with that.
And why should I be able to charge whatever rent I want? The market rent should be the market rent. People and governments that interfere with market rents, just as Paul said to start with.
But people do need to be protected from hugely rising rents because people have got to be able to pay their bills, and there's a cost of living crisis.
No, I understand that, Emma, and Richard would probably be the kindest person on the panel here who would agree with you. But at the same time, you know, landlords and business people need to be able to, you know, pay the mortgages and survive to support housing.
There's a cost of property ownership and management crisis as well. You know, that leaky tap costs more to fix today than it did 1 year ago. And if the rents is capped, it's going to become
which is very relevant to all of this is the lack of supply of property. Sure. Now, if you put in rent caps, there's going to be less supply again. However, if the government cops on to the fact that actually a lot of new build properties are helped funded by landlords because they buy them off plan and they buy them new and all the rest, that creates new supply. If they actually incentivise that, which for example they do in Australia, you get tax benefits for buying new properties as opposed to second-hand ones. If they cop onto that, then there'll be new supply and then there'll be less affordability issues. And that's the way to solve the problem.
That's the answer, isn't it? It's increased supply so that...
And the government...
That's the answer to keeping the prices down.
They've been working on for decades. And
it's getting worse, the deficit. Yeah.
What I would say, remember this government, they are allowing councils to build houses. And if Labour do get in, then they would increase that massively. But because what they'll do, they increase the social housing and they'll reduce and toughen up on the private landlords because that's what they believe in.
So I'd be interested. So in Australia, if you buy a new property, you can depreciate the fixtures and fittings over a 10-year period. Right. So there's significant tax benefits in that as compared to buying a second-hand. When the same goes if you renovate a property and make it better, you can depreciate the cost of those renovations. So again, some tax benefits of improving the properties.
And that's exactly what the government have not done with Section 24, isn't it?
Section 24 was a purely political measure. There are so many accidental landlords who see it as an easy way to get rich quick, which it's not. It's damn hard work. And it was purely inspired to stop people gaming the system purely from a tax perspective.
Very briefly, tell us what Section 24 is.
Okay, so Section 24 is where you can only, as a private landlord, owning properties individually, where you can only claim up to the basic rate of tax as an expense against mortgage interest payments. So if you're a higher rate taxpayer, you get up to the basic rate, effectively on the interest. Anything above that, no relief whatsoever.
Which means if for properties, mortgage is 10 grand a year and the rent is 10 grand a year, you're making a loss because you're getting taxed on the 10 grand. You can't offset 10 grand in interest.
Well, gentlemen, it's been very interesting. I've learnt an enormous amount about rent caps, which I think we can broadly say you're not keen on.
Not keen.
Fair to say.
Should we have a vote?
They won't happen.
Who wants rent caps?
They won't happen.
Won't happen.
Anyway, Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back with more. We look forward to seeing you then.